One of the reasons that it took me so long to come over to this side of the Atlantic as a public person is because it's sort of shameful that you all speak my language and I don't speak yours. It makes me feel like the class dunce, actually, a little bit. But the other thing was, I was sort of curious to see if there would be any reaction at all. I'm amazed that all you people are here, but you know, for years, old American rockers have come to Europe and have got a warm welcome, so I thought maybe an old American writer could come over here and get the same sort of reaction. But it's great anyway, and I really appreciate it. You know, a lot of people have asked me about the sort of stuff that I write, and don't ask me where I get my ideas because I don't know. But obviously I got a reputation somewhere along the way as a horror writer. I was in a supermarket in Florida last year, and I came around the corner and there was an old lady who was pushing a shopping cart. She was bent over with the scoliosis, and she said, "I know who you are. You're Stephen King. You write those horror books." "Well, I don't care for those horror books," she said. "I like uplifting things like that Shawshank Redemption." And I said, "I wrote that," and she said, "No, you didn't." So I guess that you'll call me what you want to call me. At the time that she picked that manuscript out of the trash and brushed off the cigarette ashes from it, we were living in a two-room apartment. We had no phone, and the book got finished and it got sent out to Doubleday, and the advance on the book was very, very tiny. And about 6 months after it was accepted and about 2 or 3 months before it was published, my editor from Doubleday called and said, "We've sold the paperback rights to your book." And I said, "Well, that's terrific. How much did you get?" And he said, "We got $400,000. And I said, $4,000, was that it? Because that figure at least made sense to me, you know. He said, "No, $400,000, and the strength went out of my legs, and I sat down on the floor between the living room and the dining room of the house where he called me. And I was just stunned. You know, it was like winning the lottery, except when you win the lottery, you don't really do anything except buy a ticket, and I had at least written this book, so I'd done the work. And it was Sunday, and I was in my little town, and the only thing that was open, I thought to myself, I have to buy my wife a present because she rescued this book. I must buy my wife a present. My God, we just made $400,000. You know, I was living at that point on $6,400 a year. We were supporting a family of 4. And I thought, I have to get her something. I must. But nothing's open. But the Rexall drugstore was open, so I bought her a hairdryer. Was the only thing I could think of. But the one thing that I remember most clearly is she had been visiting her mother that day, and she came back in our old wreck of a car. And I said, they sold the paperback rights for $400,000. We're relatively rich. And there was this sort of expression of stark incredulity on her face, and then her eyes filled up with tears, and she just put her hands over her face and wept. And I thought, God, I made a lot of money and I made my wife cry. What could be better than that? I think Carrie has become a part of the American culture. I'm not sure I know why. And the remake of the movie didn't do well in the United States. Didn't do terribly, but it didn't do well. There is a sort of fairy tale quality to Carrie. It was an early book. It was actually supposed to be a short story. At that time, I'd had a lot of success, well, not a lot of success, but I'd had some success selling short fiction to men's magazines, you know, girly magazines, the ones with the gatefolds in the middle. They've pretty well been superseded these days by the internet, but in those days, they paid a little bit of money anyway. And anything from 2,500 words to 5,000 words would, you know, it would cover the rent for a month, or it would cover the baby's penicillin, amoxicillin, whatever. And Carrie was supposed to be one of those stories, and it started to grow a little bit, and I'd gotten the idea because I'd known a couple of girls like Carrie White, One is a student who was at the bottom of the pecking order, and one is a teacher in the same situation. And as it happened, the first girl, the one that I knew as a high school student, killed herself. She hung herself. And the second one was killed by a car crossing the street from the tavern where she had gotten drunk. These were not happy girls, and I thought just once it would be great to see the worm turn, to see one of these bullied, unhappy, downtrodden kids get their own back. And so I started to write the story, and I really didn't know anything about the beginning of the story, the girls' locker room, and I remember going to my wife and saying, well, these tampons that the girls use, do they get them free, or is it like a Coke machine where you have to put in money to get one out? And she just laughed at me, and she said, let me help you with this, because I'd thrown the little manuscript away. But you're right, it's been done as a movie a couple of times. It's been done as a musical, a big Broadway musical, and then one off-Broadway that was considerably more successful, I understand. I'm waiting for Carrie the Puppet Show, or possibly Carrie versus Children of the Corn, or Chucky, or something like that. I think that would be good. I'd put my money on Carrie. I think it's all right to write about both ends of alcoholism. There's certainly no reason why you can't write about alcohol and alcohol addiction as an active alcoholic. Malcolm Lowry did it in Under the Volcano. So I think in some ways it's tougher to write about recovery from alcohol because nobody wants to make it sound like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Nobody wants to give the impression that it's all a Hallmark card and sweetness and light. But when I wrote The Shining, I was drinking heavily. Whether or not I was an alcoholic is a judgment that I don't try to make. But I certainly knew the subject of alcohol. And all those years later, the driving force behind Dr. Sleep, I didn't really want to write a tract on alcoholism. I had no interest in that whatsoever. What I wanted to do was reconnect with Danny Torrance, the little boy from The Shining. And I felt that because alcohol addiction is something that tends to run in families, that I would go ahead and let him be an alcoholic and see if he could do a better job than his dad. He never really left my mind because I'm thinking to myself, here's a little kid who grew up in an abusive household with a father who broke his arm and was always on the hair trigger of violence, and the kid knows it. And he was also an alcoholic, a child of an alcoholic. You know, in the language of today, that makes him a codependent. And I read a definition of a codependent. A codependent is a person who, if they're drowning, someone else's life flashes before their eyes. And so, you know, I've known a lot of people, and I think we all have, who may say, well, I grew up in a family where dad beat mom, or dad beat mom and me and the other kids, or I grew up in a family where dad would come home drunk and we had to tiptoe around him because he was apt to be ugly and mean and that sort of thing. And they would finish by saying, I will never do that. And then they find themselves at 21, you know, with a drink in their hands and getting in bar fights. The past has a tendency to repeat itself. And so I thought to myself, I want to see what's going on with this kid as a grown-up and what happened to his Shining. I got curious, and that doesn't happen to me very often. Usually, you know, when I get to the end of a story, I'm done with those people because, not because I don't like them anymore, but because I don't know what happens next. I would love to know what happens next to Lacey Landon in Lacey's story, but I don't. So little by little, the story of Dr. Sleep and what happened to Danny started to form in my head, and eventually the book was a result. It was a ghostly experience. And what happened was my wife and I had a little girl when we were married, and we had a little boy who came along shortly after that, who's now Joe Hill, who writes his own novels, and I'm very proud of him. He's a terrific guy, but of course I would say that anyway because I'm his dad. But what I'm trying to say is we had children young, and our honeymoon was a weekend in Boston, which we could ill afford. So 4 years into the marriage, we hadn't had any time off. And we were living in Colorado. I was writing really nothing in particular at that point. And we had my wife's younger sister with us as sort of an au pair. And she said, why don't you guys take the weekend for yourselves and just go somewhere, and I'll take care of the kids. So we got in the car and we went up the mountains, you know, and we came to this beautiful hotel in Estes Park, the Stanley Hotel. And we were very much fish against the current because everybody else was checking out and we were checking in. And I asked if we could stay the weekend, and the lady said, you can stay if you can pay cash. We sent all our credit card slips back to Denver. And I had traveler's checks for the weekend, so we stayed, and we were the only guests of the hotel. And it was creepy because the wind was howling outside, and we went into the dining room, and all the chairs were up on the tables, and the music was piped in, and it was very, very strange. And we had some wine, and we had a nice dinner, as nice a dinner as you can have when you're in this huge dining room and there's nobody else there. And my wife went back to the room, and I stayed and soaked up the atmosphere a little bit, and then I started back to the room where we were staying, and I passed one of those old canvas fire hoses on the wall, and I thought, gee, what if that turned into a snake and came after me? And by the time that I got back to our room, I had the whole book in my head, but there were no ghosts or anything. But it was a very interesting and ultimately profitable weekend. A lot of people think of The Shining as one of the scary books that they've read in their lives, and the thing is, most of them who come up to me and say, you know, that Shining, that book really scared me. And I'll say, well, yes, you were 14 years old, you were away at summer camp, and you were reading with a flashlight under your covers. Of course I scared you. You were easy. You were a virgin. You hadn't seen Friday the 13th, Last House on the Left, or any of those things. You were easy to scare. Now they're all grown up, and you know, no matter what you write, there'll be a contingent who'll say, well, that wasn't very scary, you know. So there was that, I wouldn't say nervousness, but there was that challenge. You convert the nerves into a challenge. The other thing that I saw as a problem in terms of writing the book was, in my novel, the Overlook was gone. The Overlook burned down. Of course, you will have seen the Stanley Kubrick movie, and in the movie, the hotel sort of freezes in a big snowstorm. But that's the difference between Mr. Kubrick's vision and mine. His is cold and mine is hot. So the hotel in what I think of as the true history of the Torrance family, which is The Shining, the hotel was gone, but I still wanted to bring Danny back to Colorado, to that place, because in terms of creating a novel that has a feeling of balance, you want to create a circle. You want to create something that has roundness and fullness. There's a sort of satisfaction to that. Can't explain it. It's just there. It's like a song where the chorus comes back around. So I wanted to bring him back there, and at the same time, I didn't want to force him. You don't want to force your characters to do anything if you can help it. You see what I'm saying? So, yeah, it was, but to me, that's interesting. To try and do that is part of the challenge and part of the fun. I don't understand the interest. I mean, I'm just an old washed-up writer. But it's great that everybody came. It makes me feel like Justin Bieber.